Salams from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi. You're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we're examining the conditions in which 3 more political prisoners have died in Egyptian jails. We'll look at how the US is setting up a new mechanism to disburse some of the funds it seized unilaterally from Afghanistan, and why global health groups are advocating for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. First up, the Egyptian Network for Human Rights has reported the deaths of 3 more political prisoners in jail in Egypt over a period of just 48 hours. I quote now, "The death of the 3 prisoners is a natural result of the disastrous conditions inside Egyptian prisons and detention centers, which lack the minimum standards of safety and healthcare." End quote. These are the words of Ahmad Attar, a researcher with the ENHR, who was talking to the Middle East Eye Network. These are the conditions British Egyptian activist Alaa Abdel Fattah was also talking about when he spoke to his family just this week, which made him doubt that he will leave prison alive. Abdul Rahman covers the region for People's Dispatch and spoke to us earlier via video conference. Abdul, just yesterday we were looking at reports where British Egyptian activist Alaa Abdel Fattah, who's in prison, was telling his family that he fears for his life and that individual salvation for him may not be a possibility given the conditions in which not just he but political prisoners in Egypt are being incarcerated. And now reports of these 3 deaths in a very short period. What exactly is the situation right now? What are you hearing?
As per the reports, we have heard that the 3 people, 3 political prisoners have died in less than 48 hours in different Egyptian prisons. You should know that there are thousands of, in some estimate, around 65,000 political prisoners are there in Egypt at this moment. Most of them were incarcerated after the Abdel Fattah al-Sisi government came into power, which is through a coup in 2013. Since then, Sisi has been accused by different human rights organizations, political groups, including Alaa Abdel Fattah's hunger strike, the statements he and his family has issued from time to time. They basically accuse that the government has deliberately kept the prison conditions in such a bad condition that most of the political prisoners are forced to live in inhuman conditions. And as per the various reports, the human rights agencies have reported that more than 1,100 political prisoners have died in less than 8 years, 8 to 9 years in Egypt. So I think this basically indicates the larger issue of the coup and the post-coup government which has come to power, its perspective towards the political opposition, towards the human rights groups, and towards the larger set of people who are opposed to the kind of political and economic policies his government has followed. So what Alaa Abdel Fattah is saying, he's on hunger strike, by the way, for almost 6 months now, and his health conditions are not great. Various reports have come which basically indicate that his mental health and his physical conditions are not good. From time to time, his family members have also claimed that they have been not allowed by the Egyptian prison authorities to meet. So all of this basically indicates towards the kind of autocratic political regime which Fattah al-Sisi has created, where there is no space for any dissent, there is no space for any voices which basically are raised in support of the human rights. So the overall condition, and particularly after the report of these 3 deaths, is basically becoming more and more obvious for the world to see. But yet, that is the most tragic part of it. That the kind of international backing this Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has is unprecedented. Even Hosni Mubarak did not have that much solid support when it comes to international backing.
Right. So given that scenario, Abdul, in fact, my next question was going to be what kind of pressure is the international community and human rights groups exerting on the government? Of course, human rights networks are talking about the conditions, but are perhaps unable to influence the government in any way. What is there, if any, sort of ray of hope for the entire, not just political prisoners, but the entire sort of human rights situation in Egypt?
Well, there is a upcoming global conference on climate, which is going to be held in Egypt in November. In that particular context, the human rights groups, particularly HRW, Human Rights Watch, has issued a report in which it has basically mentioned how the environmental activists, in particular, have been targeted by Al-Sisi government, and hence it has asked the world community and the members who are going to participate in that conference to basically exert some kind of pressure on Sisi government to kind of change its policies. This was in context of environmental activists, but it can be applied to the larger context as well.
Well,
We have seen that how US, which is the largest and the strongest backer of Sisi regime, which provides millions, billions of dollars to Egyptian army every year. Uh, there has been a campaign in the US to basically make that funding to Egyptian army either stop completely or make it conditional, that it
additional.
will basically make the human rights situation better. Of course, we should not expect great things on it. US has a history of supporting authoritarian regime in Egypt and in other Arab countries, including Israel in the region. So it does not care. But nonetheless, there are human rights groups, and which this campaign, particularly Allah's campaign, imagine the tragedy that Allah is now a British citizen, and even despite the fact that he was given the citizenship when he was in jail, the British government has basically has not taken any significant step to protect its own citizens. So it seems that there is a large scale from the government sides, particularly the West, which claims to be the champions of democracy and human rights. There is no attempt to kind of make Sisi's regime accountable. But at least from the grassroots level, both inside Egypt and out from the region and from the world, there are human rights groups who have been raising the issue, and individual activists like Allah who have been who are risking their life to basically make the situation obvious for the larger masses
To see.
to see.
Fair enough. Thanks for that update, Abdul. I'll ask you to hang around for a minute because we're talking about Afghanistan and the US's supposed moves to release some of the funds that it has. Well, we can discuss whether legally or otherwise usurped. We'll be back with you in a minute. Now, on the show yesterday, we were talking to Abdul, and those of you who watched the show will be aware of this, about the many fronts on which Afghanistan is facing serious crises. Today, the US State Department is announcing plans to release a big chunk of Afghan central bank funds, which it had seized after the Taliban gained control of that country after the withdrawal of NATO forces over a year ago. After a long period of silence on the subject, the US has now, in all its magnanimity, said it will release about half of the 7 billion US dollars it seized to the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland. This money will be used for monetary policy as well as humanitarian relief. The Afghan Central Bank, you'll remember, is one of the few institutions that the United States actually invested in building up in that country after it invaded. But it continues to be sidelined even though it operates on a similarly autonomous basis as the US Federal Reserve. Instead of allocating the funds back to the Afghan Central Bank, the disbursement of these funds will now be overseen by a trusteeship that the United States will set up. This is despite assurances from the Taliban that if the funds were returned to the central bank, it would allow independent monitoring. The foreign exchange reserves, naturally, are critical to the stability of the currency, prices of commodities, as well as balance of trade. And without them, the Afghan economy imploded, leading to the horrific scenario where 90% of the population faces famine, even though food supplies are not the problem. Abdul is still with us and gave us a little more detail on this story. So, Abdul, how exactly does this scenario work? It's Afghan money that has been taken away from Afghans, and now the de facto government in Afghanistan, the central bank itself, will have no role in determining how that money will be utilized. So, who decides then, and what exactly is going on?
That so-called fund in Switzerland, a kind of you can say an agency, which is of course heavily influenced by the Western powers, will have the right to decide about the disbursement of that $3.5 billion, which is primarily money of the Afghans. They should have the right to decide it, no matter what kind of government you have. Ultimately, that government government needs that money, because we know that different UN agencies have time and again, particularly last 1 year, have reiterated the point that how the millions of Afghans are facing crisis on the front of food availability, crisis on the front of availability of basic health facilities and other services, particularly education, is heavily affected because of the lack of fund. The government employees in Afghanistan have not been paid salaries on time. There are not a million and millions of people dependent on all these sectors are basically in a vulnerable condition. At this moment, an international agency, we are calling it international, but it is basically a Western agency, has been given the right to decide. If you ask anyone, there is hardly any difference between what US government thinks and this agency in Switzerland will do. So it ultimately nothing but a kind of a superficial kind of move, which basically was in some way to address the growing global criticism of US policy in particular. We should remember that 3.5 billion more money, apart from this 3.5 which has been given to this Swiss agency, there are 3.5 billion more money which is still there in US, subject to different kinds of litigation. Biden government said that this will go to the victims of the 9/11 attacks. We know that Taliban government per se had nothing to do with it, with the attack, and most of the people who were involved in the attack were Saudi citizens. So the logic behind this, of course, is superficial, non-existent. And therefore, there are groups who have gone to the US courts challenging Joe Biden government's decision and that is now subject of litigation. Then there are more than $2 billion more, which is there with the different European countries. So altogether, around 10 to 11 billion dollars of Afghan money, which if it is there available to the Afghan government and central bank, would have helped address some of the humanitarian issues in Afghanistan. So it is it is nothing but a criminal act. So basically, it is another way. If you see it, it's another way of kind of reducing the US financial whatever limited financial support it was extending to Afghan people. Even that is now reduced, and it is completely basically the Afghan money, which will be kind of a lot of it will be wasted here and there, but a part of it will hopefully reach to the Afghanistan in indirect way.
And underlining once again, Abdul, the completely sort of randomly logical and bizarre way in which the US seems to come up with all of these ideas. But thanks anyway for the update and for your time. And finally, a new push is being made to urge governments around the world to adopt a legally binding international framework towards the non-proliferation of fossil fuels from the perspective of health impact that climate change has on the global population. The WHO and the World Medical Association are among over 190 health groups that are pushing for a move towards the end of fossil fuel use to mitigate some of the damage done to the Earth's environment. Fossil fuels are, of course, a key driver of climate change as well as pollution and affect the most vulnerable populations, particularly in low and middle income countries. Because those facing the brunt of climate change-related adversities are those who are least responsible for climate emissions themselves. The group has urged high-income nations in the West, the developed world that is, to provide political, financial and technological support in the move away from fossil fuels. Anna Vrachar of the People's Health Movement spoke to me earlier about this new initiative and what it might take to actually make it happen. Anna, good to see you on Daily Debrief once again. We're talking about a positive, a brave initiative on the part of global health leaders or in the public health space Tell us a bit about the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, as it's being sort of termed.
Well, it's actually a new initiative which was launched very recently by a combination, or better to say, a group of health organizations, of health activists, of scientists, of Nobel laureates. So it's it's a group of over 190 people and organizations who are calling for a binding instrument, international binding instrument, to stop fossil fuels. And so this includes the list of signatories includes the Third Network, the Youth Advocates for Climate Action in the Philippines, the Global Climate and Health Alliance, but also the WHO, so the World Health Organization. So the main aim of the initiative is, of course, to stop all the expansion of the new infrastructure and production of fossil fuel that's being planned, that is already going on in the world. And what they are doing is actually highlighting the bad health effects that fossil fuels are having for millions and millions of people around the world. So we know that air pollution alone, it causes over 7 million deaths a year. And what this initiative estimates is that if fossil fuels were to stop, we could save over 3 million lives, 3.6 million lives to be exact. So it would be a major contribution to global health if this treaty was to go further. And of course, not to mention that it would have a positive effect on a number of other health conditions that are related to climate change. So including the proliferation of communicable diseases, including waterborne diseases, but also the effects of extreme weather events such as heat waves that we have seen have been growing all around the world this year. And so, one other thing, just to wrap it up, what the initiative is trying to do and trying to highlight is that the current approach to the climate change response has been quite inadequate. So, it misses out on several key issues, or if it does mention key issues such as a just transition, so a transition that will not be harmful for workers, which will not mean that workers will lose their jobs and go and lose their livelihoods because of action taken against climate change. That addressing these elements is quite underperforming at the moment, and that this is something that we really need to focus on in the future.
Anna, how, from your assessment of things, how achievable is a goal such as the complete sort of elimination of the use of fossil fuels, and what is the initiative suggesting in terms of how mechanisms for this to happen, and what are the aspects of the initiative that we should really be paying more attention to?
Well, the overall aim of the initiative is something that climate activists have been calling for since the very beginning. So it's good to see that it actually reached different groups, and that different groups are now ready to mobilize and endorse it and claim it as their own as well. But I think that it has to be said that achieving something like this and achieving actual concrete action on climate change will not go without a fight from high-income countries, rich countries, and the fossil fuel industry itself. So that's something that we cannot ignore. So the success of this initiative, as well as the other initiatives that we have seen, it really depends on building political mobilizations and people's mobilizations behind it. Without that, it's difficult to see that there will be concrete steps taken to take this forward. And it's something that should be taken quite seriously, because we have seen over the past decades and more intensively over the past few years that actually what has happened is that the high-income countries and the fossil fuel industry has stepped up their opposition to what's been coming up from the grassroots. So it's something that the initiative should be quite wary about. And also, it should be able to address and to push for some key elements that we have seen missing in the climate discussions, at least when international climate discussions are concerned. and that's the call for reparations for low and middle income countries, which are currently experiencing the most of the burden caused by climate change, when they have done next to nothing for causing climate change. So that's something that this initiative and the others should be taking forward. And of course, this is something to be seen as it grows and as it rolls out. But looking at the list of signatories and of the supporters, it looks like this could be actually a forum that does push for this kind of action.
All right. We'll ask you to, of course, keep tracking those developments as they, and it's likely to be, I guess, an extended, a long-term process with conversations just about beginning. But thanks very much for that update and for your time, Anna.
Thanks.
And that's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. As always, for more details on these stories and all of the other work we do, head over to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and give us a follow on the social media platform that you use. We'll be back again, same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.